In this video, I'm going to walk through the remaining 4 data page templates that are available in WebMatrix. That consists of a data report with paging, one with paging and sorting, an example of a master detail grid, and then an example of an editable data grid. The first one I want to cover is the data report with paging. So let me just rename my file here. And click OK. And as with the other series, I want to start off by actually running the sample so we can take a look at the output. So I'll go to View and Start. When you first look at this page, it looks like every other data grid example we've seen so far, with one exception. There's some numbers down here in the lower right-hand corner. Those correspond to a page. Clicking on a number will take you to the next set out of the results set. So let me close this and we can go ahead and take a look at the code that makes this possible. And we'll go ahead and start with the HTML. And let's scroll over and look. There's just a heading, a horizontal rule, and a data grid. Unlike the other examples we've seen, you'll notice that besides just all the formatting attributes that are specified in the data grid, there's also this on-page index change. This is going to tell the data grid to fire off the data grid page event every time one of those little numbers is clicked. So let's go ahead and take a look at the code view so we can take a look how this is all possible. And just really quickly, we'll notice there's a page load method, there's a data grid page event that I just talked about, and then there's this little helper function called bind grid. Let's start up here with the page load, and you'll notice that we're going to use the isPostback property of the page so that we only call this bind grid thing the first time the page is loaded, not every time an event is fired. So we need to go and look at the bind grid method. Just by quickly glancing at this method, you'll see that we're going to use a data set instead of the data reader as we have in the previous examples. Let's go back up to the top of the method and we'll see that we're going to start off exactly the same. We're going to have a connection string that's going to specify a connection to a local instance of the PUBS database. And we're going to have some command text, so some inline SQL. We're going to select the author's last name, first name, address, city, and state from the authors table. And then we're going to go ahead and order it by the author's last name. So that's very similar to the first example that we looked at that simply bound all the authors in the authors table to a data grid. Now the next thing we're going to do is go ahead and create a SQL connection object, just as we have in the other examples. And the next line is going to be the first time that it's going to deviate from the other examples. Our variable is still called myCommand, but we'll notice it's of type data adapter this time. So we're going to use a SQL data adapter, specify the command text, and then the connection object. From there, we're going to create an empty dataset object and just call it DS. And then the data adapter class has a method called fill. When you pass it in an empty data set, it's going to fill that with a result set that's based on the command text you specified for the adapter. From there, we're going to specify the data source of the data grid as being DS, our data set that is now filled because of our data adapter. And then we're just going to call the data bind method on the data grid. So every time this bind grid method is called, it's going to run through all that, fill a data set, and bind it to the data grid. Now the next thing we need to take a look at is the data grid page method, because this is what makes it possible to go from page to page. So every time that's clicked, we're going to update the current page index property on the data grid. So that just tells the data grid which page it's currently on. We're going to get the next one based on this event that's passed in, or rather this event argument that's passed in. New page index. And then we're going to call our bind grid method. So every time that little number is clicked, it's going to call data grid page. It's going to pass in a new index, so it's going to tell the grid, hey, move to the next set of records, and then it's going to rebind the grid. Now let's go ahead and take a look back at the HTML. Notice that we've specified allow paging is true, and then the next attribute is page size, so 6. We want 6 records on every page. And beyond that, just as I said before, the rest of the attributes are simply formatting. So that's all there is to that example. Let's move on to the next. Let me go ahead and save my changes here. Now we'll walk through a template that uses paging and sorting. Put this in the same spot and rename the file. And let's go ahead and run this. See that it looks exactly like the last one with the different pages, with the addition of these links on the headers. So we can sort by address, city, really any field. And it keeps the sorting from page to page. So let me close this, and we can go ahead and take a look at the code. Starting with the HTML. You see we've got the addition of the allow sorting equal true. In the addition of the onSort command, we're going to specify a new event called DataGrid_sort. And just like the last example, we're going to allow paging, give it a page size, and then specify an on-page index change. And the rest of it is just formatting. So let's go ahead and go to the code view, and we can take a look at what makes this possible. Again, we'll start with the page load, choosing the isPostBack. If it's not a postback, in other words, no other event was fired, we're going to call bindGrid. Scroll down and take a look at bindGrid real quick. And you'll notice that it's almost identical to the last bindGrid, with the exception of the sort field property being set in there. So the connection string and the command text are exactly the same as they were in the last example. Moving on, we'll see that we're using a sort field property, and if it's empty, then we've got a different command text than if it's got a value in it. If it's empty, we're just going to do a simple select from the authors table and then order by the author's last name. So in other words, we don't care how it's sorted. If the sort field property does have a value, our select text is going to select the author's last name, first name, address, city, state from the authors table, and then it's just going to do an order by and then the sort field that was specified. So from there, it's exactly the same as the last one. A connection, a SQL data adapter. We're going to create an empty data set, fill the data set, and then bind the data set to the data grid. So let's go up and look at the sort field property. You'll see that it's a string. It's protected. We're going to grab the sort field value out of the view state. And as long as it's not null, we're going to return it. If it is null, we're going to return an empty string. So you'll see that view state just holds a simple object. That's why we've got to kind of coerce it into the value, the type that we want, in this case a string. When you set the sort field value, we're just going to stuff that into the view state immediately. So the next thing that we need to look at is probably the DataGrid sort event. I'm going to go ahead and skip over the DataGrid page event because that was covered in the last example and it's exactly the same. So in the data sort event, we set the current page index back to 0, and then we're going to go ahead and set our private property sort field to the sort expression that's specified in this event argument. So the DataGrid comes complete with the ability for you to specify that you want to allow sorting. That's going to put headings on the grid, and then when you click on one of those grids, it passes this as part of the event, this event argument. That event argument object has a sort expression, and that's basically just the text value of that header column. So we're going to stuff that into the sort field, and then we just call the bindGrid method. So it's deceptively easy to sort a data grid if you use the default behavior. Let me go ahead and close this, and we can move on to the next example. Now I'd like to take a look at the master detail grid sample. Let me just rename my file. Click OK. Now let's go ahead and run this so we can walk through the behavior. Okay, we'll see that we get a grid on the top. It's got a new column with a bunch of links that say show details. And then there's a smaller grid underneath. You'll see that if you click on one of these show detail links, you get details about a title that correspond to a given author. There's some paging in here as well. You'll see that this detail grid will have every title that corresponds to the given author. Let me go ahead and close that. We can go take a look at the code. Let's look at the HTML first. Let me move the workspace out of the way. You'll see that with the master grid, we have a new attribute that we haven't looked at before called data key field. Now, every grid has a collection called a data key collection. And by specifying this, we're saying the last name. For every record, put the last name in this result set into the data key collection. That's going to come in handy later on, so just tuck that away. Now the next thing that's different about this grid is the onSelectedIndexChange attribute. We're specifying the event name of masterGrid selected index changed. The rest of it's stuff we've seen before. There's, the paging attributes and then a bunch of formatting attributes. So let's go on and move on to the code section. And we'll start with the page load. Now we're going to use the isPostBack property, and if it's not a postback, we're going to go ahead and set the selected index to 0. So that, in other words, the selected index is the first record because the index collection is 0-based. Then we're going to call a private method called bindMasterGrid, and then a private method called bindDetailGrid. So let's go ahead and take a look at the bindMasterGrid method. And all that's going to do is create a connection string and a command text variables. The command text is just the inline SQL. We're selecting author information from the author's table, just like we had before, and we're going to order by the author's last name. We're going to create a SQL connection object and a data adapter. We're going to create a data set, just like we did in the last example, fill the data set, and then bind the master grid to the data set. Let's go ahead and take a look at the bind detail grid. See, the first thing that we're going to do in this one is check and make sure that something has been selected. So in other words, if the selected index value is not greater than -1 or rather not equal to -1, in other words, it's going to be either 0 or a positive value, then we'll go ahead and execute this logic. Otherwise, we're just going to fall through and bind the details grid to whatever we have specified as the data source. So let's take a look at what happens inside of the if statement. We're going to create a connection string, again back to the pubs database. Then we're going to create this filter value string variable. Now this is where the data keys collection comes in. Now the data keys collection can be accessed by specifying an integer value. In this case, we're going to pass it the selected index of the master grid. So when you click on one of those links that I showed you that said selected author, that's going to return an integer. And from there, we're going to be able to access the given data keys collection. So that's basically going to tell us which row that we want to get the details from. So from this data keys collection, we're going to coerce it to a string value. And then we're going to use the replace method on the string class to replace any single quotes with double quotes. From there, we're going to create a command text variable, selecting the title, price, and the year-to-date sales from the title view, where the filter value, in other words, where the author's last name is equal to the one that's passed in, or that corresponds to that one in the data keys collection. So from there, we're going to create a SQL connection object and then a command object, open the connection, and then specify the data source. In this case, the detail grid, we're going to use a data reader and just execute the execute reader method on the command object. And then, no matter what happens, we call data bind. So from there, the only other interesting thing to look at is going to be the selected index changed. So anytime one of those links is clicked, all this is going to do is pass on a call to bind detail grid and execute the method we just walked through. You'll notice if we take a look at the page index change, it's slightly different than the page index change we've seen in the past, in that we're going to make sure, number one, that there is a selected index value, and as long as it's not equal to -1, we're going to go ahead and turn off the selected index for the master grid, and then we're going to call bind the detail grid. So in other words, every time we page, we want to rebind the detail grid. And then we're going to set the current page index to the new page index, just like we've done in the past, and then bind the master grid again. And that's really all there is to this. Again, you're getting quite a bit of functionality for just a little bit of code with this example. So let me close this and we'll move on to the last data page template I'd like to review. The last template I want to walk through is the editable data grid. Let me just rename my file here. And let me go ahead and run this. So, what you see is just a simple grid. We've got two additional columns here. One's got edit links, and one's got delete links. You'll see that it pages. And then there's an additional tag down here for add. If you click on the edit, you have the opportunity to change anything in the line except for the author ID. And that's because the author ID is actually used as the key in the select statement that creates the grid. So you see that we'll add a new one here. And then select update. And here's the row we added. And then you can just delete it by clicking the delete link. Now let's take a look at the code that makes this possible. See that we have a data grid, a link button, and a label. We're specifying a data key field of the author ID. And then we have to specify the onItem command, datagrid_item command. So we're going to implement the datagrid_item command event. Then you have to specify the onEdit command, an onUpdate command, an onCancel command, and then finally an onDelete command. You'll see that allow paging is true. We've got a page size of 6, and then of course we've specified a page index changed event as well. The rest of it's just formatting. So let's go take a look at the code. Now the first thing you'll notice here is a few member variables. The first one's just a connection string to the pubs database, and the next one is just a default select statement. Selects the author's ID, first name and last name from the author's table. And then the next one is just a Boolean value. Next thing I want to look at is the page load event. We're going to use the isPostBack method of the page object, or property rather. That way we're only calling this bindGrid method the first time the page is loaded. So let's take a look at the bindGrid method. You'll see it's very simple. It's going to create an instance of the SQL connection class. It's going to create a SQL data adapter. It's going to create an empty data set, and then it's going to fill the data set and then bind the grid to the data set. So we'll see that we're just going to use that default connection string, or rather the member level up here. And the same with the data adapter. It's just going to use that default select command. So this is the method that actually binds the grid that we looked at on the web page a moment ago. Next thing that we need to look at is the item command. You'll see that anytime a sort or an edit or an update, cancel or delete is executed, we're going to fire this event off. It's going to fire off this check is editing method, which is right here. We're going to pass it the command name, which gets passed through in this data grid command event arguments. So basically what this method is going to do is just return, or rather just determine if we're editing a row. So in other words, it's not a cancel and it's not an update, therefore it must be an edit. Next thing I want to look at is the datagrid_edit method. This is the event that gets fired when someone clicks on the edit link. So you'll see the first thing that happens is we check the is editing Boolean value, and as long as it's not true, so this current row is not being edited, we're going to tell the data grid to go ahead and make the current item, or rather the current row, editable. So simply by specifying the edit item index property, the data grid just takes care of providing text boxes in each of the fields. So after we mark the data grid's row as being the row that we want to edit, we call the bind grid method. Next thing we should look at here is the update method. This one's just slightly more complicated, but it's doing all the basic things we've looked at so far. The first thing to notice is that we're going to grab the ID, the last name, and the first name out of the grid. And we're going to do this by just selecting the text value out of the controls collection. When the data grid gets generated on the page, it's really just an HTML table. And so we can grab the different cells, and then within those cells there are controls. So we're just going to take the default control out of each cell. And if you just look, these numbers are just hard-coded in there. The ID is in the third cell, so it's actually index of 2, and then of course the last name is the third, and then the first name is the fourth. So after we populate these properties, or rather these variables, we're going to create a SQL connection object and an update command, or just a SQL command. And then we're going to specify some command text depending on whether or not the adding new property is true or false. So if the adding new property is true, we're going to use an insert statement. So we're just going to insert the first name, last name, and the author ID into the authors table. And we're going to specify the values that got passed in. You'll see down here underneath the command text lines, this is where we're actually adding the parameters to the collection from the values that we specified in the first few lines of the method here. So once we've added our parameters to the collection, we're going to try to open up a connection to the database. And then notice we're going to call this execute non-query on the command object. So if you don't want to get a data reader returned to you, you use the execute non-query. And actually this method will return an integer value indicating the number of rows that were updated by the command. You'll see that there's a catch statement in here to catch any errors, and all that they're going to do is just write some text out to the label, and it's just going to be the exception to string value. And then finally, no matter what happens, we want to close the connection to the database. So then the last couple things that are going to happen in this method is if the adding new property is true, we're going to set the current page index back to 0. So we're just basically going to tell it go back to the first page. And then we set adding new back to false. So once we've gone through all of that, we've got to tell the data grid, basically turn off edit item index. So we're going to just tell the data grid that there is no edit item index selected right now. And then finally, we call data bind or bind grid one more time. Data grid cancel just tells the data grid to stop what it's doing and go back to its original state. So we're going to set the edit item index back to -1 and then call bind grid. We're also going to set the adding new property back to false. So the next thing we can look at here is the data grid delete event. You'll see the first thing that happens is we check and see if isEditing is true. If it's not, that means that the row we're on is not being edited, so it's safe to remove it. So then we're going to grab this string value called key value out of the data grid by looking in the data keys collection. So we're going to look for the data key that corresponds to the one that has the same ordinal value as the item index. So in other words, the row that's clicked on. Next thing we're going to do is create a SQL connection object and then a SQL command object. We're going to call this command object delete command. And we're just going to specify a simple SQL statement that will delete the row where the author ID is equal to the author ID that's passed into the, or rather that's retrieved from the data keys collection. So we'll see delete from authors where author ID is equal to, and then that key value. Going to open the connection, going to execute a non-query, and then immediately close the connection one more time. Going to immediately set the data grid current page index back to 0, so it's going to go back to its first page. And then we're going to tell it that we're not editing anything by turning the edit item index back to -1. And finally, we're going to call the bind grid method one more time. So the next thing to look at here is the data grid page method. This is going to happen anytime someone clicks on one of those numbers in the lower right-hand corner. First thing, of course, is to check and see if we're editing a row. As long as we're not editing a row, we're going to set the current edit item index to -1. So in other words, tell the data grid we're not editing anything. And then we're going to set the current page index equal to the new page index as specified by the event argument passed in. And then finally call the bind grid method. Now one last event to look at here is the add new click. So whenever someone clicks on that link that was in the lower left-hand corner, this is going to be fired off. First thing we want to do is check and make sure that we're not editing a particular row. And then we're going to set adding new equal to true. So there's another property called adding new. Set that to true. Create a new SQL connection and SQL data adapter. For the data adapter, we're going to use the select command that we used in the very beginning, or that's at the member level. So we're just going to basically select a row out of the authors table. We're going to fill up the data set. And then we're going to create a new array of objects called row values. This way we can add a new blank row at the end of the data set. So we've got this row, this empty row of values. You see there's three values in our array. We're going to call the tables collection on the data set, the first table in the tables collection, .rows.add. So the data row object is used. We're going to call add, and we're going to pass in this empty array of object. The next one, we're going to figure out what the added item index is by using the record count as specified in the first data table. Next thing we want to do is make sure that the record count is greater than 1, and if it is, we're going to decrement that by 1, and then we're going to set the current page index of the data grid equal to the record count divided by the page size. So since we specified the data grid page size of 6, it'll be the record count divided by 6. Next thing we want to do is set the data grid edit item index to the record count. We're going to use the mod function. So record count mod page size. In this case it's 6 again. And then we're going to set the data source equal to the data set that we created, and then call data bind. This last little bit is kind of confusing, so I want to walk back through it real quick. So just real quickly, we're going to create an empty array of objects, and we're going to add a new row to the data tables collection, or basically to the data set. So we just need to insert a new row on our data set. Now, in order to do that, we need to figure out how many rows we've got in the data table, and then we're going to figure out what the current edit item index is. So if you think about this, what we're going to do is add a new row on the very end of the record set. So we've got to figure out exactly where that falls. In order to do that, we have to divide the record count by the page size. So that just takes us to the very last page. In other words, if we've got 24 records and it's a page size of 6, it's going to take us to the 4th page. Likewise, with the edit item index, we want to find out what the very last item is. So we've got to do the record count. Again, if it was 24, mod the page size of 6, it'd be 0. So then, again, all we're going to do now is bind the data set with our new row in it and call data bind. Now, let's take a look at this adding new. This is the property that I've been referring to as I've gone along here. And you'll see that all we're going to do is stick this Boolean value into the view state and then pull it right back out of the view state every time we go to use it. And then here we have the bind grid method one more time. So there's a lot going on in this, but if you think about the kind of functionality that you get essentially for free, it's not too bad. It'd be very easy to take this template and just modify the SQL statements to point to a table that you need, and you could very quickly have a handy little utility for editing any table that you wanted to. Or for that matter, you could really, by modifying the SQL statements, you could modify a set of tables. So in this example, we looked at 4 new templates. We looked at the data report with paging and sorting, a master detail grid, an editable data grid, and then just the simple data report with paging. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed the videos.